This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
We also welcome our returning celebrity guest, all the way from Duluth, colleague and friend of ours, Esquire, Adam Vanderwerff.
Making me feel like Spear Chucker from the movie.
Is that a bad thing?
No.
Are you saying you're our ringer? Are you going to identify their ringer?
I will find their ringer.
All right. So let's jump right into it for the evening. Tonight, for our 245th episode, we discuss MASH, or Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, from 1970, celebrating its 55th anniversary later this week. Directed by Robert Altman, written by Ring Lardner Jr., music by Johnny Mandel, starring Donald Sutherland as Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce Jr., Elliott Gould as Captain John Francis Trapper John McIntyre, Tom Skerritt as Captain Augustus Duke Forrest, Sally Kellerman as Major Margaret Hotlips O'Houlihan, Robert Duvall as Major Frank Burns, and Roger Bowen as Lieutenant Colonel Henry Braymore Blake. Recognition for this movie? MASH was released on January 25th, 1970. On a budget of $3 million, the film would gross roughly $81.6 million and finish third at the domestic box office for 1970. Did anyone look at what the top two producing movies were for that year, or grossing movies?
Nope.
Love Story?
Yes, that was number one.
I don't have the other one.
Airport.
Oh, yes.
The two directly behind it were Patton and the Aristocats, for what it's worth. Many of the premier critics of the time were effusive in their praise for the film. MASH won the Grand Prix du Festival International du Film, later named the Palme d'Or, at the 1970 Cannes Film Festival and received 5 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Director for Robert Altman, Supporting Actress for Sally Kellerman, Film Editing, and it won for Best Adapted Screenplay for Lardner Jr. The film is number 17 on Bravo's 100 Funniest Movies. It has also been recognized by the AFI in the following lists: 1998's AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies at number 56. In 2000, the list of AFI's 100 Years, 100 Laughs at number 7. In 2004, it was on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Songs with Suicide is Painless at number 66. And in 2007, on the 100 Years, 100 Movies 10th Anniversary Edition, it was number 54. In 1996, MASH was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. The Academy Film Archive also preserved MASH in 2000. MASH currently holds an 86% among critics on Rotten Tomatoes, an 80 score on Metacritic, and a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So, as we begin each week, Dad, what is your relationship to this film?
I started watching the TV show when it was first released or first aired. I watched the first episode. It was not too long after that they broadcast the movie very sanitized on network TV to help promote the TV show. And it was done on CBS. And I watched the movie and couldn't understand where the TV show necessarily came from because of so many differentiations between the characters and the fact that Frank Burns got carted off in a straitjacket and all that. Never did get an opportunity to see the entire film until, oh boy. So this would have probably been about 1973 or 74. I think the first time I saw the entire film was in the late 70s, maybe 78, 79 when it happened to be on HBO.
You'll have to forgive Danny. He has a bit of a cough this evening, so his voice is changing a little bit. But I guess my experience with the film is knowing of the TV show, but not necessarily ever really having significantly watched the TV show. I think sometime in the last 2 years or so, you told me to try and watch it because like the entire series is on Hulu or something like that. And I think I watched 2 episodes and I was very, very bored. So I've never gone back to it. I think it is obviously culturally relevant for its time period. It's one of the most successful, if not the most successful sitcom in television history. Most of its major characters are still somewhat household names, at least for people probably 40 and older. But the movie itself, I didn't watch until I want to say it was during COVID, and I was trying to finish up the AFI Top 100 list. It appears on both the 1998 and 2007 list. So I want to say this would have been a summer of 2020 watch, and I just remember being so bored. We'll see if that's reflected in my assessment of the most recent watch this evening. Adam, I have to imagine, because when you selected this and I said, you want to do MASH? Really? And you demanded to be on this episode, you feel very differently.
I do. So MASH had a bit of a revival on, it was either VH1 or Comedy Central right around the time I was in high school. And it became popular among my friends because at the same time I started high school and was finishing high school, Iran and Iraq were in full swing. We had friends who were going over to countries we didn't know a damn thing about and experiencing things very similar to the themes and raison d'etre of MASH as a general rule. And I thought the show was hilarious as a teenager and strove to emulate some of the practical jokes. In fact, we definitely picked up some of the jokes and transported them into our everyday lives. And it wasn't until later, after my first job, I worked in the movies and books department at a Target, and they sold the giant MASH box set, all 11 seasons in the movie, in a cool green, khaki green box, that I discovered there was a movie. And so the first thing I did when I cracked that thing open went, what is this? And popped it in my DVD player and proceeded to learn more about this series that I had been enjoying for 5 years at that point.
So what is the movie about?
Finding humanity and personalizing how desensitized you have to get to make it through a conflict like war.
I think this is an anti-Vietnam film that's not necessarily in the story or in the plot about Vietnam.
Correct. But what it does is it casts a shadow on military services and paints it in a more realistic view, which is that it's not pretty, it's not clean, it's not heroic. And the men and women who are involved look for anything they can, whether carnal pleasure, alcohol, or dark comedy, in order to get through the days.
Well, I specifically say as much because Robert Altman, I think he did a couple of small feature films. He did a documentary in like the late 50s, but really most of what he did was on television. And not to step on my own did you know section, but he got fired from a lot of productions because of his kind of anti-establishment attitude. And so he got the opportunity to do this. Part of what appealed to him was kind of the anti-war stance that the book takes, or at least anti-military. And so while it is about the Korean War, it still kind of looks a lot like Vietnam. It's kind of out in a jungle-esque area. It looks very similar. And so it's got a lot of similar themes. And so for those, I would say that it's of its moment a little bit more than maybe we give it credit for, because it is counterculture-esque or born from that attitude. Because this is certainly not what was being appreciated in, let's say, the silent majority of America?
So I'm not sure what movie you're watching because the movie I saw was surrounded by mountains and like rocks rather than actual jungle. And I think the themes of the horrors of war maybe were of the time for Vietnam, but they continue forward because journalism as a whole changed in how it presents war. Movies started changing how they presented war, and all of that kind of spawns from this movie.
Okay. I think we got different things out of the film.
Well, think of it this way. For the film that was just behind it, what, fourth or fifth, was Patton, which was a glorification of war and in the military, versus this, which was subversive, tore everything that was military down and said, this is folly.
Well, I think the difference in it is if you look at the opening scene of Patton, which we will in a couple of months, there's this rigid kind of honor code that Patton promotes. What it is to be a man, what it is to be a soldier, what it is to be an American. That this movie kind of undercuts. And I guess that's where my point was, is that the two most strict characters, the ones that seem to want to promote order and regulation and all the things that the military is about, Houlihan and Burns, are the two that end up getting either kicked out or kind of undermined at every turn. And the people we celebrate, the heroes, are the guys who are more buffoonish, that are kind of the clowns that treat everything as a joke, except in the one theater that they have to be very serious, which is in the operating room.
I mean, isn't that some of the point of the film, though, is that the strict adherence to regulation doesn't always promote the best efficiency or the best outcome, and that you need some wackiness to grab onto when horrors come around.
Are you talking about MASH or about Our Office?
Yes.
Fair enough. So, what exactly would you say is the cultural impact overall for MASH? And I will expand it further because the TV show is begotten from the movie. So, without one, you can't get the other. But it comes out 2 years after the original film. They're kind of in many ways linked. I already said that it may be the most successful sitcom of all time. It obviously still holds the number one highest rated show of all time with its finale. But what exactly is the further tentacles of this movie? Because I think there are probably very many.
Well, I don't think you're going to have a whole host of anti-military films in the 70s, in the 80s, without MASH laying the groundwork. You're not going to have The Deer Hunter. You're not going to have Coming Home. You're not going to have Good Morning Vietnam.
Platoon.
Not going to have Stripes.
Yep.
Stripes I could give more credit to. I think that the anti-Vietnam films that are specifically about Vietnam, whether it's Apocalypse Now or Good Morning Vietnam, Platoon, etc., were going to come anyway due to the sentiment of the time that was somewhat anti-military. That I do think there were people that wanted to make topical movies that were somewhat of a backlash. But I will say Stripes seems very reminiscent of this movie.
I think the anti-war films would have not necessarily had the backing if this had not been such a commercial success.
So, contemporaneous with Vietnam, how we were reporting on, televising, and otherwise talking about war was shifting a little bit. You know, for the first time, you have correspondents in the field kind of showing some of the horrors and things. And there was an extreme backlash to that when it first came out as disrespectful to the soldier and things. And one of the things that I think comes with MASH is kind of an acceptance that, yeah, that's actually how it is. And they have to deal with this grim reality. And so, you know, I'm with Dana. I don't know that those movies get to the levels they do of criticism without MASH. They may have still existed, but I don't know that they get to go as far.
I think I buy more the argument that they may not have been able to be made without them, but I think there's maybe a better argument that they're made in the wake of Apocalypse Now, which took a tremendous amount of effort on Francis Ford Coppola's part to try and get made. I mean, obviously, we have a documentary about the things he had to go through just to get the financing and the rest of it, and then what happened while they were filming it to get that movie made. And I think that begets more Vietnam content than necessarily MASH. But I do think that this is a unique, in some ways, outlier because while it's not a Vietnam film, we've kind of associated with as much. And then the TV show is still contemporary to an ongoing war because we hadn't pulled out until I think, 75?
73.
73? But even so,
Yep.
So you're 3 years before the end of the war. The TV show starts before the end of the war. And the sentiment at this point was very low toward the government and the military and such. So I do think there was a warm reception, but I think this has maybe a higher novelty than maybe a additional legacy toward those other films. I think that this film, though, and what it begets in a sitcom, because the film is kind of laid out sitcom-esque like, because it's kind of got vignettes or kind of almost mini episodes to it, like the visit to Tokyo or the football game. Those are almost like half an hour segments that kind of are an episode to themselves. And I think that the way that Altman directs this begets that kind of TV making, that also births kind of the modern sitcom as well, because while you had situational comedies, they hadn't broken out of some very rigid structures to that point. It was I Love Lucy, it was The Honeymooners, it was a couple of other things. And MASH kind of breaks with convention a bit by becoming very popular about a subject that ordinarily you wouldn't have been making fun of.
Except that the novelty of the shenanigans that go on in the military were already well documented by television. The Phil Silvers show, Sergeant Bilko, and all the shenanigans he pulled as an operator within the Army. I mean, that played into World War II veterans. And Hogan's Heroes is the same way. The difference in this is it's more raw and shows not a varnished or whitewashed version of what is going on. It was bloody, it was messy. There was a lot that you didn't want to think about or talk about. So this was much less pristine than anything that had been done before, more raw, showing what it was to be in that situation.
Well, and one of the things that comes with those shows is it's just soldiers being soldiers, boys being boys. This is part of bonding and fitting in. Whereas MASH makes it explicit that this is a reaction to the horrors that they're experiencing, that they have to find some outlet.
Is there anything to be said that this is also the first F-bomb used in film history? You could give it a little bit of credit for breaking ground there. I think it would have possibly inevitably happened anyway. But think of the amount of amazing movies that we've covered that dropped the F-bomb since this movie. Basically, any Marty Scorsese or Tarantino or De Palma film allows some debt of gratitude to this breaking ground.
Well, do you know why the censors allowed it to go through?
Because it's a very quick scene.
No, because they didn't figure anybody'd watch the film. They weren't expecting it to be a commercial success. So they thought, okay, fine, we're not going to make a big deal out of this. So they allowed it to go through.
I mean, I'm not going to give it all the credit in the world. I do think that this starts something, but it takes other films capitalizing on the opportunity to see where it ends up. Obviously, you have more grimy crime dramas and thrillers and all the stuff of the 70s builds on this as an initial thing. But in some ways, you could also credit MASH with being kind of like the Jackie Robinson of the F word in movies.
Okay.
I mean, there may be something to be said for being first through the wall, but coming from someone who's always had F words in movies and film, I didn't know it would be that big of a deal. Before the rating system and some censorship, I mean, movies in general were relatively raunchy and debauched. It wasn't until the censor board came in the 30s that things like using swear words became a big deal.
We're going to make a big deal about Psycho having the first toilet flush in a movie. I think we can make a bigger deal out of the use of the F word. I mean, how many F words have not been said in cinema history compared to toilet flushes?
Well, that's just crazy.
All right, Dad, are you ready to dig further into the film? Do you have our plot summary ready for us?
I do. MASH, directed by Robert Altman, is a sharp, irreverent satire that reimagines the war film as a chaotic and darkly comedic theater of absurdity. Set in a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War, the film follows the misadventures of surgeons Hawkeye Pierce, Donald Sutherland, and Trapper John McIntyre, Elliott Gould, whose insubordinate antics clash with the rigid military hierarchy. Altman's freewheeling ensemble style captures the camaraderie and anarchy of a unit forced to find humor amidst the horrors of war. With its anti-authoritarian ethos and whip-smart dialogue, the film critiques the machinery of war and conformity without sermonizing. The overlapping conversations, naturalistic performances, the subversive tone make MASH both a product of its era and a timeless commentary on the absurdities of human conflict.
Thank you. Did you know? The 14-year-old son of director Robert Altman, Mike Altman, wrote the lyrics to the theme song Suicide is Painless. According to Johnny Mandel and Robert Altman, the film's famous theme song was intended to be, quote, the stupidest song ever written. After attempting to write the lyrics himself, Altman said he found it too difficult to write, quote, dumb enough, and instead gave the task to his 14-year-old son. Mike Altman allegedly wrote the lyrics in 5 minutes, not even expecting to be paid since he was the director's son. Because of its inclusion in the subsequent television series, he continued to get residuals throughout its run and syndication. His father was paid $75,000 for directing the film, but his son eventually made about $2 million in song royalties, with payments continuing from first syndication through the present day, as MASH continues in syndication around the world. Did you know? Tom Skerritt recalled the dialogue was about 80% improvised. In order to create a different kind of atmosphere, Robert Altman cast some of the parts from improvisational clubs who had no previous movie or TV experience. Did you know? The first take of the shot where Hot Lips is revealed in the shower didn't work because Sally Kellerman anticipated the reveal and was already lying on the floor when the tent flap went up. To distract her, Robert Altman and Gary Berghoff entered the shower tent and dropped their trousers while the shot was rolling outside. While Kellerman was staring at them, the tent flap was raised, resulting in her genuine surprise and shock when she realized what had happened. In the special edition double-disc DVD, they say that Radar, Gary Berghoff, had been standing naked beside the camera, and that's the reason why Sally Kellerman looked so surprised when the flap was raised. Did you know? The story goes that when Robert Altman was editing the movie with editor Danford B. Green, they had nude pinups on the walls of the editing room. The head of post-production came by and tried to stop Robert Altman from using the editing machine, as he wasn't a designated editor, and Altman threw him out of the editing room. The next day, a memo came down from the 20th Century Fox front office stating a new policy that there would be no pinups on the walls of editing rooms. Altman took the memo to the sound recording studio and added it as one of the loudspeaker announcements during the film. Did you know? Speaking about the troubles he had with the studio, Robert Altman was quoted as saying, "The film wasn't released, it escaped." And with that, we will take our first break, and we will be right back.
Are the movies that win Best Picture at the Oscars actually worthy of being called the greatest movies of all time? I'm Andrew from the Revisionist Almanac, and my podcast looks to answer just that question. The show is a monthly interactive experience where I dive into a past year with a rotating group of guests to look at what won Oscars for picture, director, and acting. We revise those winners and then let the actual winners battle out our revised picks in online polls where you, the listener, get to have your voice heard. So come check out the show on all podcast streaming platforms and find the show on every social media platform using the handle Rev Almanac. I can't wait to see you there.
Before we jump back into the episode, next week we welcome back returning guest Peterson W. Hill of the War Starts at Midnight podcast to discuss The Shop Around the Corner from 1940, directed by Ernst Lubitsch, written by Samson Raphaelson and Ben Hecht, music by Werner Heyman, and starring Margaret Sullivan, James Stewart, and Frank Morgan. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's ReelGood. We left off at Best Performance. Dad, who did you have down?
I had Donald Sutherland. I thought he was the funniest of the group and had the most, basis of the story. I liked his performance, so that's where I went.
I have him as my secondary. I think he has the best range of any actor in the movie, and I think it's on display here. I think he shows the most amount of heart, the most amount of intuitiveness in his acting, and I'm actually just impressed the further on with the more movies we've added to the list of ones we've covered of Donald Sutherland, just variously, how different each role seemed to be from every movie that he was in. His work in The Dirty Dozen is similar to his work in MASH, but it's not in a leading performance. And his work in MASH is completely different from his work in Clute, is completely different from his work in Ordinary People, etc., etc., etc. I marvel at his range as an actor, that he can just pull off so many great characters and feel completely lived in all of them. But ultimately, I went with Robert Altman. As I said before, I think he creates the structure for what is the TV show by kind of putting these vignettes together. It feels somewhat like a diary that's lived in during the course of the movie, because while it seemingly has no narrative structure, and I think that was part of the reason I had so much difficulty watching it the first time, and I will say I enjoyed it more this second time. It felt much more watchable than the first time around because I wasn't focused so much on the story structure. It felt kind of like small chapters in a short story, and more like probably the TV show that I think eventually took their cues from his work on this movie. And so from a tone standpoint, from kind of this counterculturism, I mean, to even having his 14-year-old son write the theme song that obviously became more popular, I think that he deserves my best performance.
Interesting choice. While Donald Sutherland is fantastic and Hawkeye is one of my favorite characters of all time, for the movie, it goes to Elliott Gould and Trapper John. You know, his switch from serious to goofy at several points in the movie always felt genuine. The one that strikes me the most is the scene where they're coming in with the congressman's son and he's acting all, oh, goodness, this is going to be terrible. Yeah, but when do you get to go to Tokyo with your golf clubs? And the way he delivered that line in that genuine manner kills me every time. And so I give it to Elliott Gould on this one.
I would argue with my dad. I don't think Sutherland was the funniest character. I think it is Gould. But I think Sutherland has the best acting range in the movie. But Dad, who was your best secondary?
I have Ring Lardner Jr. for the screenplay. I thought the screenplay did a fairly decent job of blending the realities of war with the comedic aspects of war.
Do you have any trouble with the fact that there is a statement by one of the primary actors that I mentioned in the Did You Know section that 80% of the film is improvised? I mean, I know he's the only Oscar winner out of this movie, but does that at all bother you?
No. How to put this? In my experience in acting through high school and into college, improvisation is still somewhat structured, and you have to set the tones, you have to set the parameters and the areas of which it's done. And I think he's the one who kind of put them in the right situations and created an atmosphere that allowed them to then improvise certain lines.
Wouldn't you credit that more to Altman, though? Both from a casting standpoint, trying to cast more unknowns for their improvisational skills coming from comedy clubs, and creating an on-set atmosphere towards improvisation as opposed to the writing?
Maybe.
My thought on that is 80% of jokes is setup. So if the 20% they borrow is the setup, I'm fine with it.
It's a good point. Who was your best secondary?
I don't know the actress's name, but Lieutenant Dish. She played into that role wonderfully. She delivers a lot of jokes with just body language. The smirk as she's flying off after having her night with the dentist, Dr. Penis, is just fantastic comedic timing. And, I think she does a lot without tons of lines, which is why she's up there for me.
That is Joanne Flug. Most charismatic? I have the theme song because it's been fucking stuck in my head for 4 days now.
It doesn't help that I love whistling that song, and I will just whistle it randomly.
Yeah. I have Sally Kellerman. I mean, I loved the stuff she did afterwards. She had a quality that just was so over the top always. She could just go off in these tirades that her level of exasperation was just comedic in and of itself.
For me, this one goes to Donald Sutherland. He is, while in the show they claim Hawkeye's smooth, he's often abrasive and over the top. And in fact, in some ways, his character on the show is a combination of Duke and Hawkeye, where in the movie he actually is very good at just being a charismatic leader character and person who can woo somebody. So, definition of charisma, and he's there.
Let's move to best scene then. I have 5 nominees here. I have Trapper John, or the introduction of Trapper John. Then I have Hot Lips and Frank, which is their hookup in the subsequent, I guess, Frank getting kicked out. Then I have Suicide is Painless, which is the, as our guest put it, incident with Dr. Penis. And then I have Surgery in Tokyo and the football game. What did I miss?
My best scene, which is the opening scene. I like that, the introduction, the whole stealing of the Jeep. I think it sets the tone for this film that it's going to be anti-military and GI. And from there on, you're put on notice that this is not going to be the traditional military film.
So before I answer this, what are we calling the surgery in Tokyo? Which portion of that whole vignette are we calling the scene?
It's about a 12-minute scene. Well, 12-minute section. And I have no idea how to peel off any one individual scene because it cuts a lot back and forth between things.
Okay, well, just my favorite hunk of the movie is the setup to surgery in Tokyo when they're playing golf and the helicopter comes in, blows their golf balls all over, blows their umbrellas all over, and then we get that line that I was talking about from Trapper John. Yeah, but yeah, when are you going to get to bring your golf clubs to Tokyo? The setup is absurd. What happens is absurd, and the reason for the surgery is absurd, and it's just absurd cubed in this wonderful comedic moment. So if that's in that scene, find that scene. Otherwise, that's subset.
All right, so out of these, what is the best scene? Dad, you already said you were going to select stealing a Jeep, but I have Suicide is Painless, which is the, I guess, vignette with the dentist. I just think it's probably one of the more structured scenes. It's dealing with something that shouldn't exactly be funny. Suicide is obviously, I think, in a way, a lot more serious now, or at least a lot more seriously taken than possibly it was at the time. Somebody can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's taken a different meaning now than it was 55 years ago. And I don't know if we'd be poking fun at it, but for somebody to not be able to perform and then thinking they were latently homosexual, I also think that's kind of unusual, but it plays into a very playful attitude, and I think Altman does a good job of structuring the scene. There's an obvious homage to The Last Supper, and then obviously with the background music being a kind of an acoustic version of the theme song, I found it to be one of the better scenes in the movie, even though I think you could arguably nominate the entire surgery in Tokyo as well.
I don't know. That scene breaks down Hawkeye a little bit with how he does treat Dish, even if the joke ends up being great. I don't know. That always detracts for me from that scene. But I'm surgery in Tokyo all the way. It's my favorite. It shows the absurdity all around of what's going on and how decision making is made in those situations, and how you just have to react to it sometimes when there's nothing to do but you want to scream. Okay, you can't scream, now what? And I think it does it in such a wonderful comedic way. That's my favorite scene in the whole show or whole movie. That's me.
As far as for me, favorite scene, I have the surgery in Tokyo as well. I think it's probably the funniest scene out of the whole thing, even just ending on, what is it, the colonel, the general, ending up in bed with the prostitute and taking the incriminating photos. I think it's actually a fairly good scene if you just took it out by itself. And Gould and Sutherland are the perfect pair to orchestrate that entire sequence.
For me, my favorite scene is Frank and Hot Lips, and it's also my most indelible moment. It's the part of the film I always remember. How they played it up, how they got the recording, how they broadcast it, Frank's reaction.
Well, for me, the indelible moment is actually the first scene with stealing the Jeep, Duke assuming Hawkeye is the driver. The first time I watched this, I think that was the first time as a young adult I really saw the problems with making an assumption and actually having it click for me. And how, just seeing somebody next to a Jeep doesn't mean that's necessarily their job. So maybe from my own personal life experience, that one wins for that reason.
I'll just say, I don't know why it's the most indelible thing about this. Maybe because it's kind of an outlier compared to the rest of the film. But if you were to ask me anything that happened in the entirety of the movie from 4 years ago when I first watched it, it would be the football game, because it seems like the thing that stands out the most.
It's a little Benny Hill, isn't it?
Well, yeah, especially with the quick editing and such. That'll take us to our second break then. We'll be right back.
Hey, movie lovers, this is Kyle, host and producer of the Movie Wars podcast. We're not just a movie review podcast. There's plenty of those. On Movie Wars, a panel of stand-up comedians blends humor with deep film analysis using their unique war card system to grade movies across key categories. Each episode delivers thoughtful insights and spirited debate, offering a fresh comedic take on film analysis. New episodes drop every Thursday on all podcasting platforms and YouTube. Deeply researched, gut-wrenchingly funny, you'll love Movie Wars.
Before we jump back into the episode, and before we get to the Stanley Rubric in a minute, if you're ever curious about our Master Greatest Movies of All Time list that has every graded movie we've ever discussed on the show, there's a link in the episode description of every episode of this show, or you can go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com and find it as the top entry on the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast show page. That has the grades we've done so far for all 220 movies we've graded, and we continue to add more each week. Make sure to check that out as we go and follow along. Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes. Tony Slattery, 65, British actor. The Crying Game, Peter's Friends. comedian and television personality. Whose line is it anyway? Leslie Charleson, 79, American actress. General Hospital, Love is a Many Splendored Thing, The Day of the Dolphin. Claude Jarman Jr., 90, American actor. The Yearling and Rio Grande. Robert Macri, 79, American actor. Cheers, Thanks. Raspity, Street Kids, Believe in Santa. Bill Burge, 92, American actor. Ernest Saves Christmas, Ernest Goes to Jail, Ernest Scared Stupid, and a comedian. Robert Pratt, 77, American cinematographer. Batman, the 89 version. Brazil, and The Fisher King. And Sam Moore, 89, American singer. Band Sam and Dave, songs You Don't Know Like I Know, Hold On, I'm Coming, You Got Me Hummin', Soul Man, and I Thank You. 1992 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee.
I obviously don't have much of a relationship with many of these performers. The one that I do, I will say that I've heard many songs by Sam and Dave, and several of their songs, Hold On, I'm Coming, and Soul Man, obviously are the top two among those, but have been favorites in a playlist of mine for quite a while at this point. So I obviously will miss his presence, but his music will live on, just like the contributions from the rest of our cast here. And so we recognize these here with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. Let's move to best funniest lines. First one up I have, all right, bub, your fucking head is coming right off.
I'm not going to actually do it because I think it would blow everyone's ears out, but Donald Sutherland's whistle. Every time he delivers it, it's hilarious.
Duke Forrest. Now, fair, Henry. If I nail Hot Lips and hit Hawkeye, can I go home too?
Hot Lips. I wonder how a degenerated person like that could have reached a position of responsibility in the Army Medical Corps. He was drafted.
Colonel Merrill. All right, I demand an explanation. Hawkeye. Someone get that dirty old man out of this operating theater. Merritt. Dirty old man, I'm Colonel Merrill. Hawkeye. I don't care if you're Jack Armstrong, all-American boy. If this kid's chest gets infected, I'll tell the congressman who did it.
Yeah, but how often do you get to bring your golf clubs to Tokyo?
General Hammond. Henry, I have a report here from your Major O'Houlihan. Now, she makes some accusations here that I frankly find hard to believe. Colonel Blake. Well, don't believe them then, General. Goodbye.
I'm out.
Wow. Only two.
That's it. I must be a fairy.
Captain Ugly John Black. Anybody know if this is an officer or an enlisted man? Hawkeye. He's an enlisted man. John Black. Make the stitches bigger.
I think I'm out.
All right, I have one final one. Oh, Frank, my lips are hot. Kiss my hot lips. All right, let's move to the Stanley rubric then. Legacy is up first. This is a measure of the legacy of the film. Roughly 5 years after the film came out, so roughly 1975 to now, what is the legacy of the film? We split this category 5 points and 5 points for a total of 10 between the industry and the audience at large. Dad, would you like to go first or second?
I'll go first. For the industry, I'm giving it a 4.5. And the reason I'm going that way is because, first off, it is considered a classic film by a lot. It's protected, etc. But the other is it started and led to the TV show, which has become iconic and in reruns and continues to be. And the only reason I don't give it a full 5 is because of the differentiations between ultimately the film and the TV show. It took a different direction, and for that I can't give it a full 5 up. But from the public, the fact is, I would say maybe 25% of people are familiar with the film, whereas I think a significant higher number are aware of the TV show. So I'm in the public. I'm at a 2.
For a total of
6.5.
Well, I'm going to give it a full 5 for the legacy from within the industry. Again, I think the vignette storytelling, that's used in the movie is kind of unique, and I don't remember a movie before doing it that way. Setting up the television show obviously gives it such a great moment, and as I've mentioned before throughout the show, I think the way they treat the war was new and novel, and even if there were other movies coming, I don't think they have the license to go as deep as they did without the cutting commentary that comes from this movie. So, from an industry standard, I give it a full 5. I am with Dana that, however, the movie, in terms of the general public, is not well known. I watched all 11 seasons of the show before I even knew there was a movie, and I only discovered it because I got the box set. And so, for that reason, I'm going to give it a 2 for a cool 7 points.
Okay. I think it would be hard to argue based on the fact that Donald Sutherland had only done very bit parts. He had not really been a leading actor to this point before this movie, and I think this proved that he could do more, proved his range as an actor beyond just doing these bit parts like appearing in The Dirty Dozen. So then you also have Robert Altman. This is his real first breakout film. Not that he hadn't done featured films before, but this is the one that really kind of jumpstarts his film career, more or less. Because up until this point, he'd been mostly a television director. And he goes on to have a fairly nice 70s run, does some stuff during the 80s, but comes kind of back during the 90s. And he's, by some standards, one of the great directors of all time. So I think between just those two, you'd have a high industry score. But obviously going on to create or being the catalyst to, if not the most successful television sitcom of all time, it's in the top 3 probably. So I have that at a full 5. But on the audience, I don't think you guys are giving it enough credit for the name recognition that people have. Yes, it is from an association with the TV show, but they know the characters, they know a lot of the jokes, the structure. A lot of that comes from the movie. And while there are not a lot of people that have seen it, I can't go up to a 5. I'm going to go up to a 4 on that side of it. So I have a 9.
It's an interesting thought. Here's my rebuttal, if you will. Ask them what movie Augustus Duke Forrest is from.
Well, from that standard, Colonel Blake.
People know Colonel Blake from the TV show. He was in the first 5 seasons.
3.
Or 3 seasons.
Oh, all right. But either way, we have a 7.5 average between the 3 of us. All right, let's move to impact and significance. This is a category judging the impact and significance of the film within the first 5 years that it was released. So roughly 1970 to 1975. What is the impact of this among both the industry and the audience at large? We again divide this category 5 and 5 for a total of 10 points. I will go first here only just to say, do we really have to argue over a 10?
Not to my mind.
No.
The TV show alone would probably make this a 10.
Yeah.
So that is a 10 average between the 3 of us. Moving on. Let's move to novelty then. This is a measure of the originality of the film, whether that be the writing, the comedy, the subject material, etc., and then how well they executed on that originality, or just in the film in general. We split this category again between 5 and 5 points for those 2 subjects for a total of 10 points. Adam, let's let you lead off on this one.
Originality at the time this comes out, it's the first one to really openly use humor to try and poke at the seriousness that is war and tie those 2 things together. So I give that a 4 in this category for that. As far as the execution, this is where I think the vignette type storytelling and the lack of time in the operating room and how serious some of the things in the operating room, that when you compare it to like the show, you lose a little bit of it. And so I'm only going a 3 here, so that's a total of 7.
And they almost wanted to cut out all of the operating room scenes, but a couple of people visited the set and told the producers that was what held the film together, because you almost lost that entirety of it. I will say that I agree with you on the 5. Well, I agree with you to a point, but I'm going to go to a 5 on the originality. I think this is a fairly unique concept. If you go back and look at kind of anti-military films of the moment, there weren't a lot of them. Maybe Dad's commentary on Sergeant Bilko and some other things where it's comedic. I don't know if that's still counterculture in the way that this is, though. So I'm going to give it a full 5 for the originality, but I agree with you on execution. I think this movie does suffer a bit from its lack of budget. The fact that it only had a $3 million budget, I think, is felt throughout the film. While the cinematography, as far as framing, works, I don't think the lighting is particularly well done. And I do think that the lack of a story structure through the whole thing does make it difficult for new people to appreciate the film. I know that we gave it a hard time on last week's show, Kieran specifically saying that it was unwatchable. I know I've gotten comments from other frequent guest and collaborator Andrew Corns that this is not a very good war film in his opinion. So there are people out there that don't appreciate the film, and I have to think it's because of the execution overall. And then maybe where we get into with the next category, some of the datedness of the film. But we'll wait on that, obviously. So I have an 8.
All right. I have a 5 for originality because it is the first. Execution, I guess I'm going to go with a 4 for execution. I thought it was done well, except that, and we'll get into, again, more of the classicness, it's almost a frat boy mentality throughout the film. And I think it could have been done a little less like that. And so I'm giving it a point down for that reason. I know that that probably was the way things may have been, but I don't think it was a choice that needed to be made to make this film classic or to continue to have the film resonate with some of the themes and concepts that it was trying to convey. So I'm at a 9.
Well, thank you for making some easy math. That makes it an 8 average between the three of us. Now, classicness. This is a measure of how well the film has aged over time. We used to start at a baseline of 7 because we felt there was more room to move down than move up. I introduced the possibility of starting at a 6 last week. I will not hold anyone to that if you've judged it under the old scoring system. I'm just proffering that as an opportunity to maybe think a little bit differently about the film. But at dinner this evening, before we started recording, I think my dad said that this may be one of his lowest ever classicness scores for a film. So with that in mind, I will let him lead.
Okay. Normally we start at the 7 or had been, all right? The amount of chauvinistic attitude towards women and the nurses is unbelievable. I mean, it was almost like they're walking around feeling like they were one giant penis and every woman should just fall all over them. The fact that they treated them so offhandish, they were just, instruments by which their jokes could be implemented, their irreverence towards anything that was of discipline or of cultural norms. Now add to this what I consider one step below a gang rape, which is the shower scene with Hot Lips.
Boy, that's strong language.
Oh, if you tried to do that nowadays,
I understand.
I mean, you'd be crucified, and you should be. I mean, it was just, and it's done in a way that you're supposed to find it funny. You're supposed to chuckle along that they did this.
It's definitely a violation of privacy. I'm not going to debate that, but putting it on the level of like that level of violation,
It's pretty
I'm
darn
not sure
close.
I'm ready to go there.
Okay, if you are forced without any knowledge or consent to be completely exposed to a large group of people,
My objection is not that this is a bad thing. It is. My objection is that you're putting it up there with something that is like just short of murder in my mind.
okay, maybe I'm going a little too extreme, but this, in retrospect, this is just not at all what I think that it ages well at all. And the fact that they're so condescending to anybody who has any kind of level of interest in discipline or in the military. I understand it's supposed to be poking fun at the establishment, okay? But it goes overboard at times. And the fact that the way they treat Father Mulcahy throughout the film as being almost a joke, it just, to me, again, gets a point down for that. And so I by the time I got done with all my little things, I'm at a 2.
I think that is matching my lowest classicness score, possibly. I think. I might have one lower. I can't remember what I put for The Quiet Man, but it was pretty far down there. All right. I'm going to offer this to you, Adam. Would you like to follow that up, or would you rather me?
I don't know where you are, Tom, but I'm in much the same boat as Dana. I'm going to add on to, the other things that, while I don't have as much problem with the disrespect to the establishment, because I think that's somewhat the point of the movie. The use of slangs like Dago throughout the movie takes the place of that for me, and further degrades, where this is supposed to be. Not only because it's a slang, but it's not a slang that's commonly used anymore. Drops it even a little further, because it took me a second to realize what they were actually talking about, and considering that they're using slangs wouldn't apply the best to Father Mulcahy, which is an Irish name, and instead should be a Mick or one of the other ones that would apply and would have still been commonly used at the time. So not only did they use a slang, they used the wrong one. For that reason, I'm at it too. It's the chauvinism is a problem. The get me a nurse who doesn't put her tits in the way. That line was unbelievable the first time I heard it. It's still unbelievable to me. The use of the wrong slangs, the treatment of the African American running back on the Generals team is just absolutely abhorrent. Yeah, I can't. Chew.
Homosexual slurs.
Yeah.
I was going to try and be a little more forgiving. I was going to try and give it the benefit of the doubt, but it's going to be really hard for me to follow that up and sound any bit of credible. I will also say, in its unfortunate offense, the humor is a bit dated, and I have to agree on the sexism, the misogyny, the racism, the other cultural ploys that just have not aged well. You might give it a point for a little bit of timelessness, but I don't know. I'll just match the two and we'll settle up from there. So a 2 average between the three of us. It might be one of the lowest classicness scores we have. That moves us to rewatchability. Now, last week I introduced the idea that we forego the original Kieran B test that we've been employing since he decided to become a guest on our show fairly regularly about 2 years ago, 2.5 years, or a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, somewhere in that range. But instead to look at objectively, is this a fairly rewatchable film? Now, that is a little bit subjective yet, but just generally, I didn't feel that this movie dragged nearly as much as I did the first time that I watched it. Now, part of that is I just wasn't expecting much plot, and so I could just watch for the rest of the story and enjoy it a little bit more that way. The other thing is that I watched it in between watching a Packer playoff loss, so anything that was entertaining during the boringness that was helpful. And so maybe breaking it up into small pieces or chunks during commercial breaks was enough to help spur me through this movie. But I guess I'm going to be a little bit forgiving. Is this something that I'm necessarily going to go back to often on a personal level? No. I still think that the lack of narrative structure does not help people get introduced to the film or want to revisit it often. But I'm going to give this a 5.5.
I'm going to stick with my test that I've pitched for this. The what I buy it out of if I saw it in a $5 movie bin. And as much as I enjoy this film for some of the laughs and being as novel as it was, it's not with all the shenanigans that goes on with the misogynistic comments, the racial slurs and things. Every time I watch it, I am constantly shook at how insensitive it is. And some of that is the point of the movie, but it also makes it hard to watch. And so while it's a good reminder that those things exist, it's not one I'm going to pick up and choose to watch on a regular basis. It's still a good movie, and I've rewatched it a couple times, so I'm going to say a 5, but I wouldn't have bought it out of the bin.
Let's put it this way. If somebody really said, hey, let's watch the movie MASH. Okay, I'll sit and watch the movie with them. Probably. Not 100%, but am I going to put this on my own volition? No. In fact, I'm 61 years old, and if I never see this film again before I die, I'm okay with it. So I can't give it any higher than a 4 for that reason. I don't object to watching it if I have to, or if somebody is asking me to watch it, but I'm not going to do anything more than that.
Okay, so that is a 4.83 average between the three of us. Thanks for making harder math. For audience score on this one, we had a 73% for Google users and an 82% for Rotten Tomato users, giving us a 7.75. So to repeat the categories, we had a 7.5 for legacy, we had a 10 for impact and significance, an 8 for novelty, a 2 for classicness, a 4.83 for rewatchability, and a 7.75 for audience score, giving us a final total of 40.08, and currently placing it on our list at number 185, shortly behind The Lady Vanishes, and only 0.02, so 2/100ths, ahead of Gran Torino. So, if you have any issues with our scoring, as at least one person has had recently and made us maybe think about and readapt the categories, you can write us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on any of our socials at gmotepodcast, or you can find us on the website ronnieduncanstudios.com/gmotepodcast. Let us move to remaining questions. What happens to Frank? Obviously, he shows up in the TV show, but he's just let off. Does he go home? Is he dishonorably discharged?
He's put in the nut house.
I mean, that was such a non sequitur from what happened to him all of a sudden being in a straitjacket. You would have to think it was a Section 8. I don't know, that doesn't count as a dishonorable discharge, but I would think it's a full Section 8.
I don't know what that means, but sure, I'll agree with you.
Discharge for mental defect or illness.
I see. Okay. And then, where do you think the idea to convert this to TV came from?
Well, I to me, we've touched on it a number of times. This movie is told in vignettes. It's set up already to tell it in episodic form. And the idea to break this down and just add a little depth to the vignette makes perfect sense to me. Every time I watch it, I go, boy, how did they not just think this should have been a TV show and we could have skipped the movie altogether?
Dad, other than The Odd Couple, were there any other movies that were really being adapted to TV shows from the time period? Because I'm not as familiar with that era of TV.
Planet of the Apes became a TV show that lasted a couple of seasons. I'm not thinking of any other ones off the top of my head, but ultimately what ended up, as far as I can tell from this, is I know that the studio wanted to do a sequel. Altman really was opposed to it. They couldn't get anything going with it. So the studio decided, all right, well, we've got kind of a preliminary idea of where we want to go with this. So let's turn it over to some creatives and see if they can turn it into some sort of a TV show. And who did they get? Gene Reynolds, who, what? Was the guy who basically established Hogan's Heroes. And he became the primary lead of this, working with Larry Gilbert, who had been a writer for Sid Caesar in the 50s. The two of them created the show with some studio oversight as to what they could do or couldn't do. And that's where the show started from.
I didn't know they were pushing for a sequel. That's cool.
I didn't either. But as far as I knew, Gene Reynolds didn't really have much to do with the creation or show running production of Hogan's Heroes. That had more to do with the guy who was behind The Godfather.
And that was whom?
I'm trying to find his name. Albert S. Ruddy.
Okay, because Gene Reynolds was the primary script consultant and writer.
Okay, because Ruddy created it with another guy and then was the pitch man for it to CBS. And they go through that entire section in the first episode of The Offer, which I still think is a very good TV show that not a lot of people saw.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. So any other remaining questions for either of you?
I miss it every time. Margaret comes in and makes a stink about what this does to her reputation, and then she just disappears. What was the resolution to that in the movie? Or was it there at all?
Are you talking about after the shower sequence?
Yeah. She comes into Henry's office and she's throwing a storm about what this would do to her command and what, her as a commanding officer and her reputation.
And she says, I will resign my commission. And he basically dares her to resign her commission. And she doesn't. And then she's a cheerleader at the football game. So in essence, my guess is she just kind of learns to live with the antics and kind of stop being straight-laced, I guess. She acquiesces. But since nothing really happens other than you see her at the end of the film on the sidelines, I don't know. You can kind of draw your own conclusions, but that's kind of what I come to. The other thing I will say about the shower scene is it just feels a little bit unnecessary. Had they done that around the time when Burns is like let off in a straitjacket, it would have felt more authentic, but it just feels like they come back to it way later in the film after like everything else was resolved. So the necessary urgency to do that as a prank just didn't feel there for me. So any other questions?
One of the interesting features of the movie is the catch to the whorehouse they catch the colonel in and used to take the pictures was that it was funding care for the local children. That was a new, that's the essential theme of the TV show is that the doctors there grew to care for the locals just as much as they did for the soldiers coming through their operating room. And I think that part of it from, my discussions with other veterans at VAs and things is very real. But do we think that actually ever happened, like the use of that to fund treatment in Korea or other theaters?
I look at the historian here because I have no idea.
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Another form of care package, I guess?
Sure.
Oh, that's bad. And the other thing that surprised me was the doctor's tour of duty. I think they say at the end when Hawkeye's going home to end the film was that they were there for 6 months. And that doesn't track with anything I know. Did that surprise anyone else or catch anyone else off guard?
I again defer to the historian because I do not know nearly enough about military history to be able to give a decent commentary on this.
Well, they were having trouble getting doctors originally. I think the tour, the points from the rotation was much more lenient the beginning of the war, and as things progressed, as they oftentimes do in wars, they upped the number of points necessary to rotate just because they were having trouble getting surgeons.
Right, and I remember that episode in the TV show. There's actually a whole episode where Hawkeye goes on a tirade because of the upping of the points. And so I guess that was more my conception of it, was that they used kind of a bait and switch to get these doctors to come over, or if they drafted them with the promise that it would be short-lived and wouldn't have huge impacts on their careers, and then just kept upping the points as the thing dragged on because they just still needed them.
It's possible. So I want to thank our guest for being on with us this evening. He has dedicated some time while he is on the road. So obviously some difficult challenges there. But just a quick note that you will be back, I guess, next with us for, I believe, Return of the Jedi.
Yes, I will, and I'm excited about it.
But that is not going to be till May. So until then, is there any place that you would like to share that people can find or keep up with you on the socials and the internet at large?
If you know me at all, Tom, I'd much rather spend my time away from the office outside in the woods, and so I try not to be on the socials.
Fair enough. All right, Dad, any final thoughts for the week?
2 things. First, I have started a Substack account, and so anybody who was watching the show, I'm publishing a little brief thing. I had written for my children through the years this thing, or created this list of the rules of life, and I am now going one by one through those rules and writing a little blurb about it. So if anybody's interested, look for it there. And second,
just 1 second here on your Substack. Is that behind a paywall or is it free?
It is free. I do ask that you subscribe to the page, though, just so that I can keep track of who actually is looking at it and who may be following me. But it is free. I'm not charging. So.
All right.
And second, I started Simon Says today.
Yes.
Is that the 4-hour monstrosity for this year?
No. It is a
4-hour
monstrosity,
monstrosity,
but it is not a 4-hour thing.
You're
Luckily,
not talking about
it's-
the Brutalist, are you?
I don't know. We discussed a 4-hour movie that you have to watch for the upcoming nominees.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's the Brutalist, and I'm going to enjoy the hell out of that. But anyway, no. Simon Says is the film I selected for him for losing last year's Oscars bet. It is a film with currently a 0% among critics on Rotten Tomatoes, starring everyone's favorite basketball player, Dennis Rodman, and Dane Cook is his sidekick, in a spy thriller through Paris.
What could go right?
with John Panette, with a monk, with a shaved head, with the monk cut, wearing monk robes. Why, I have no idea. But he's referred to in the film as Free Willy.
Why not? I mean, that sounds amazing.
And and it's the fight scenes are incredibly horrible. The plot is buffoonish, and if I had no respect for Dane Cook before this, I have even less respect for him now. To the fact that he is humping a couch and licking it as he's dreaming about Heather Locklear.
Sounds like he should be a VP candidate.
Yeah. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it is far from anything of any valuable or value in watching.
Well, you have fun with that.
Yeah, well, I have to watch it now, and then I'll have to record a show about it.
So, folks, be on the lookout for Dana's episode on Simon Says, because he has to do an entire episode on that film in the style of the show. So that will be definitely painful for at least one of us. But Otherwise, the only other thing that I have is we're slowly working our way through the James Bond catalog as we're watching them one by one. We will be doing an official rankings of all 25 Bond films up on our YouTube page. That will not be available on the audio feed. That will just be a YouTube-only exploration. We'll be doing a live stream of that eventually. We haven't decided yet when we are going to do that, partially because we still have like half the films yet to watch, including all the really bad 80 films. But you can be on the lookout for those exciting things coming up. But otherwise, that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me back. See you in a couple months.
I think people who like to smoke candy and listen to cigarettes will love it. Next week, we welcome back returning guest Peterson W. Hill of the War Starts at Midnight podcast to discuss The Shop Around the Corner from 1940. Directed by Ernst Lubitsch, written by Samson Raphaelson and Ben Hecht. Music by Werner Heyman, starring Margaret Sullivan, James Stewart, and Frank Morgan. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in our fun. You can also email the show at thenewronnydinkensstudios.com or at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, or find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Letterboxd, or TikTok at the handle @GModePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ryan Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.